So welcome everybody. My name's Rachel from Bats Without Borders, and today I'm really delighted to introduce our two speakers. And before they're going to give us a bit more information, but I just wanted to highlight SABAR, which is the South African Bat Assessment Association. And we're going to be hearing more about the great work that they do. And I'd highly recommend that you visit their website to find out more. And so Kate and John will be introducing themselves, and they're both ecological consultants working in the UK, but also across Africa. Over to you, Kate. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Rachel. I'm just going to share my screen. Yeah, hello everyone. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where in the world you're at. I'm currently based in the United States, but I'm actually a South African by history, and that's where my business is run. And I wear two hats. I'm part of the South African Bat Assessment Association, which I'll tell you more about in a few minutes. But I also run a consultancy doing bat and wildlife work called Nkululeko Wildlife Services. Rachel asked me just to give a little bit of a history on how I got into bat work and bats and wind energy work, just for those of you who are out there who may want to enter into this profession, either in Africa or other parts of the world. But yeah, so my career as a professional started at the Johannesburg Zoo as a zookeeper. And my interest in bats was sparked there by bats that the zoo had, as well as injured or orphan bats that came in. So I then sort of nurtured that passion, and yeah, it hasn't left me in the last 22 years. And when I got into the consultancy business, it served me well. I also did master's level research on bats. So yeah, so if you have a passion for bats, and conservation, I encourage you to get into this field as bats need our help. Also, furthermore, if you haven't listened to Christian and Tanya's talk from the last talk 2 weeks ago, I would encourage you to do so. It was very well worth it, and a lot of what they said there complements what we're saying here, and certain things that we're talking about might differ slightly from what they're talking about in terms of content. So the two talks definitely go hand in hand, and I would encourage you to listen to both. Thanks. Okay. So the South African Bat Assessment Association was founded in 2013. It was due to a growing concern that bats were not considered in many EIAs and were overlooked in terms of the impact that development has on bats. So a group of us got together and formed this association. It's a member-based organization and made up of a variety of different professionals and interested parties, mostly specialist consultants, academics, various NGOs, regulatory authorities, and people from industry and development. The people you see on the screen are the panel of 9 that lead the organization, and that is voted, those people are voted on annually. The one seat here represented by a logo is for the South African Wind Energy Association. Their environmental chair representative always sits on our panel every year, and that changes depending on who's in that position. Okay, our aims and objectives of SABAR are mostly to ensure that development goes ahead without unfortunate or unnecessary impact on bats, and that we can ensure sustainable development. We also want to ensure a high standard of surveys that are being conducted and consistent. There's definitely been a huge improvement since we've implemented various guidelines in terms of the level of studies that are happening. As such, we're the custodians of the guidelines, and we we review these and revise them regularly. We try and do it every 2 years. Whilst several bat interest groups exist, well, two in particular in South Africa, the Gauteng and Northern Regions Bat Interest Group and BATS KZN, do a lot of work on awareness on bats. If we get the opportunity, we also try and make people aware wherever we can. We provide a platform for discussions, and I'll tell you just a little bit later on how we do that. And if there's any conflict in terms of a type of study that needs to happen, or authorization, or something, whilst we're not a regulatory body, we do give our few cents worth in terms of our opinion on the matter. Okay, so how do we meet our objectives and our aims of the organization? And if you listen to Tanya's talk 2 weeks ago, you'll know it's all about trust and about interaction and discussions. So that's what we do. We try and have as many meetings as possible, in terms of the fact that we're a voluntary organization. So everyone who sits on the panel does it in their own time. But we try and have an annual meeting every year, which we've been very successful for since 2013, whereby we invite all our members and guests to come and discuss what we've achieved in the year, and any challenges we've had, and try and come up with solutions together. We engage with industry regularly through the South African Wind Energy Association, and sometimes with individual developers. We engage with government. Together with BirdLife South Africa, we often attend governmental meetings whereby we provide some training and input and try and influence some of the decisions and authorization procedures that happen, just so that bats are considered in the authorizations. So as most of you know on this talk, you'll know a lot of these facts, but wind energy has always been in existence for almost as long as man has tried to harvest wind for power. But probably in the 1980s was when it took off more commercially, especially in the more developed countries like the United States and others. But in South Africa, it's only really been sort of a subject since about 2010. And the first operational wind energy facility became operational in 2014. And as we all know, bats are killed by wind turbines, either through barotrauma or blunt force trauma. These numbers can be in the hundreds of thousands for, recorded in several of the Northern Hemisphere continents where a lot of research has been done. Unfortunately, in South Africa, a lot of the Southern Hemisphere continents, bat fatalities are underreported, and there's not as much published works. Hopefully that'll be changing for South Africa soon. So as a result of these large numbers of fatalities, we're obviously very concerned about cumulative impacts on populations of bats in particular, but as you're aware, wind turbines also kill birds. So for bats, especially in the Southern Hemisphere, where we don't have issues like white nose syndrome and things like that, wind energy is certainly one of the biggest threats that we're facing for bats. Okay, this looks like a very busy slide, but what it's basically showing you is that, so whilst we don't have this published yet, there is, just through an accumulation of information from sites that I've worked on, and from information I could gather from publicly available sources, wind energy related bat fatalities are on the rise, and they're accumulating. The only reason for this sort of drop in 2020 is that we don't have a lot of information available. That information is still going to get out, I suppose, to the public. As well as COVID-19 did produce a decline in the search effort. And just a few trends that we're picking up from data. So these fatalities that we're showing you here are just unadjusted figures, and it's just a subsample of what is actually being killed, because this is only for few sites that are reporting. Also, it's only for a certain time period of the wind farm's life. And yeah, there's several other years and sites that are not reported in this subset. That, as I said, it's also unadjusted values. So Jonathan will be discussing with you later in terms of adjusting bat fatalities for various biases. But we are picking up some trends from this information, and we do know that there's certain families like your molosses and your Vespa bats, in other words, your free-tail and your plain-faced bats, that are being killed in higher numbers than other species. But we do have fruit bats being killed in South Africa, which is sort of not reported, obviously, in the Northern Hemisphere. I'm sure there are several fruit bats being killed in various tropical and Southern Hemisphere countries, but we actually are recording these and can hopefully put out some data on those soon. We also see different seasonal trends, with late summer and autumn being the highest times of fatality. You can see that both on this graph and this pie chart over here, but also a fair number of fatalities in spring, with a substantial drop in winter. From a subset of samples that we submitted to the Durban Museum of Natural Science, and that was also analysed by Kate Richardson and Lee Richards, who are probably on this call. I know Kate definitely is. We noticed that for the free-tail bats, a high percentage of males were being killed than females, but for most other species, a higher percentage of females were being killed. So this is all just sort of out there at the moment, and hopefully watch this space for maybe some publications on that. Yeah, so obviously, this is the findings. One, has people looking under the ground, and this is sort of the visual of the impact. In terms of development of wind energy in South Africa, it certainly is booming. And this is a map of most of South Africa, with the green areas being wind energy applications, and some of the grey and pink areas also either being wind or cogeneration in terms of wind and solar. So yeah, you'll see these large clusters of developments that are planned or in operation, and some smaller, just scattered areas of development. So why should we care? Why should we care that bats are killed? Most people don't love bats, but bats actually are extremely important. Not only do we have a duty of care to protect the environment and the biodiversity living in it, but bats provide some very important ecosystem services to humans. They pollinate several important and economical plants. They also disperse seeds for forest generation, and this is very important, particularly in Africa. I'll talk about it in one of my last slides. But insectivorous bats also eat large quantities of crop damaging pests, as well as medically important insect vectors. So in South Africa, whilst there's not specific laws protecting bats, bats can be protected under various other policies and laws and various guidelines that are in place. And in terms of international guidelines, which many countries are signatories of, and sort of conventions and treaties, most noteworthy is the Convention of Biological Diversity, and the Bonn Convention, which is the Migratory Species Convention, in terms of protecting species that migrate. Many bats migrate, either locally or at a larger scale. There's also guidelines in place at an international level with the World Bank and the IFC, and then obviously your various red data species listings with the IUCN. On a national level, the umbrella policy, the National Environmental Management Act, does sort of describe precautionary principles and the duty of care I was talking about, as well as the Biodiversity Act, which is a derivative of NEMA, which obliges us to protect biodiversity and threatened species. We've published various bat and wind energy guidelines that I'll be speaking about. And there's various other sort of efforts that the Department of Environmental Affairs, now the Department of Environment, Forestry and Fisheries, are putting together with SANBI and other organizations, such as the screening tools, the EIA protocols, the Species Environmental Assessment Guidelines, the Mitigation Hierarchy Guidelines. And all of these things require that registered scientists with the South African Council of Natural Scientific Professions are the ones that are doing the study. So it does ensure that a high level of study is being done, both at the pre-construction and operational level. Then when you get to the provincial level, if you are doing work on bat species in certain areas, particularly protected areas, you do require permits. So in terms of those guidelines I was discussing, as SABA, or the South African Bat Assessment Association, we've brought out 4 types of guidelines already. And one is to do with pre-construction monitoring and best practice guidelines for that. The other, and I'll be discussing that in a little bit of detail now, operational guidelines, which Jonathan will be talking about. We've also brought out a bat fatality threshold guideline, which I'll be discussing, and a broad mitigation document, which Jonathan will also be discussing. So these pre-construction guidelines, as I mentioned, wind energy became a topic in South Africa in about 2010. In 2011, Samantha Stoffberg and Sandy Sauler brought out the first edition of the South African Good Practice Guidelines. And since then, we've revised these 4 times and are now on our 5th edition of the guidelines. And those are the ones that are currently in place now in 2020. So just to run through them quickly, just very briefly, the main points. Obviously, the document sets the scene for wind energy globally and in South Africa, and also, sort of highlights certain species that are at higher risk than others. But the main point of the document is for consistent and a standardized form of monitoring, so that studies are comparable and done to a high standard. So the minimum requirements in summary is that the latest edition has separated 2 different size classes of wind energy facilities, those being equal to and greater than 20 megawatts, and those being less than 20 megawatts. And you'll see the different time frames: a 6-month study for the smaller sites and a 12-month study for the larger sites. It does require that at least 75% successful recording takes place. We do ask that people strive for 100%, but we do know that often challenges on site can lead to interruptions in monitoring, but no less than 75% successful monitoring. As you would imagine, with the turbines rotor sweep height getting higher and higher, it's important that we know what is happening within the area of influence in terms of the rotor swept area. So monitoring at height is a non-negotiable, and this is normally done on a weather meteorological mast. And we have some very high level minimum requirements in terms of the number of microphones per height specified in the document. This is an absolute minimum, and obviously the more biotopes or habitats you have on site, we encourage more monitoring stations and microphones. We also prescribe that manual surveys are done in areas not covered by the the static monitoring stations. So this is normally done by a driven transect with a handheld detector, and you get a good idea of activity across the site. It's not as reliable as the static monitoring, but it does provide a little bit of extra information. We also prescribe that roost searches should happen where available. So if there are potential roosts on site or known roosts, they should be investigated and buffered in a sensitivity map if necessary. Something that also has come to our attention over the years is that even if people are doing good field work, often the level of reporting is not so great. So we are encouraging people to analyze their data and report on it in a systematic way in terms of looking at a comparable set of analyses that we can then use across the country to look at different levels of activity, fatalities, etc. We encourage people to gather site-specific weather information and to incorporate this into their reports. So you can get average levels of activity, you can get activity compared with weather parameters, you can get activity over time, and this is important in terms of looking at peak levels of activity and implementing mitigation measures. From these pre-construction reports, we do see them being very valuable. Some people do question whether a pre-construction report is needed. Why not just look at the operational impact? And I personally disagree with that quite substantially, because you can gather a lot of information in your pre-construction research that assists with correct siting of the turbines, any exclusion zones, drawing up of your sensitivity map, and also providing some initial operational monitoring and mitigation requirements that will allow the client or the developer to know upfront what they might be in for in terms of mitigation. Sometimes if you know the impact is going to be high and there's definitely going to be turbines in high sensitive areas, one can be proactive and put measures in place in these areas ahead of time, so that we're not left on the back foot. Sometimes it's very hard to implement mitigation measures once the facility is in operation, because there are budgets that have been agreed, financial planning that's been done, and it's very hard for the developer to change that program at a later stage. But there should always be room for adaptive management in terms of findings from the operational monitoring. Yeah, so what happens if one is having, how do we know when one is having an impact? That is a question we get asked all the time. How many bacs is too many? So, what sort of standard? And it's very hard. It's a very controversial topic, the topic of thresholds or drawing a line in the sand. But we felt it was quite important to do because of several reasons. So the motivation for this threshold concept was, it was a request from industry. We have noticed that high numbers of bats are being killed at some facilities. And also we need to move away globally. Up until now, largely bat fatalities have been reported based on megawatts or numbers of turbines. But this is not, as we realize, this is not a ecologically sound way of reporting bat fatalities, and will not provide any value in terms of population level effect. So we wanted to adapt a more population level approach to reduce the possible impacts, cumulative impacts on these populations. Another thing that's happening largely internationally is that bats only that are threatened or of huge conservation concern are the ones being protected, and only if those bats are being killed are mitigation measures being implemented. But what we're noticing is in South Africa is that it's largely least concern species that are being killed. And in the USA, one of the species being killed in the highest numbers is the hoary bat, which was at one stage a least concern species and very abundant and is declining rapidly. So much so that Frick et al. 2017 predict that in the next 50 years, if something's not done about it, this bat will be highly endangered. So we don't want the same to happen for the bats like Todariida aegyptiaca, the Egyptian freetail, and the Cape Serotine bat that are being killed in high numbers in South Africa. So as I said earlier, it's about drawing the line in the sand. That line might not be perfect, but it's just important that we start with an initial line, and as we learn more information, we can adapt that, and it can be a living document. So we based our threshold principles on as much literature as we could. Obviously most of the literature comes from the Northern Hemisphere, but in the latest version, so 2018 is the current version, but we do have a 2020 version coming out imminently. So we based our information on mostly Northern Hemisphere species because that's the information that's available. But in this 2020 version, we have tried to bring in some Southern Hemisphere examples, particularly South Africa where we can. We look at adult bat survival. This is the most important factor in terms of population levels declines. And as we've seen from our data in South Africa so far that's gone to the museum, most of the animals being killed are reproductive adults. So that's quite a blow to a population if you're losing all your reproductive adults. We also look at incoming bats in terms of rates of reproduction, number of young per litter, survival of the young. We have considered density-dependent factors. However, it's very difficult to incorporate that. And we look at then what additional percentage of decline, other than natural mortalities, would lead to a decline in population levels. And we did some calculations around that. And we incorporated different activity levels in different ecoregions, and I'll discuss that in my next slide. We also considered the size of the study area in terms of the level of impact that it would have. This was valuable in terms of looking at single sites or a collection of sites or cumulative impacts for a larger area. And obviously we had to make several assumptions and use expert elicitation where necessary. But as I've said, we will adapt the document as new information comes available. So we chose the ecoregion concept just because they are ecologically distinct areas, and as well as the fact that they're not too fine scale as the vegetation at vegetation level, and incorporate various things into them like vegetation, climate, etc. So we felt that these were good units to use, good ecological units to use. And for the latest 2020 version, we will be reverting to the Dinnerstein 2017, Dinnerstein et al. 2017 version of the terrestrial ecoregions. So you'll see that just from some of our initial analyses that different ecoregions definitely do have different activity levels. So the blue bars are the mean levels of activity per ecoregion based on several tens of microphones. So yeah, at least 90 microphones in various ecoregions, and the orange line represents the median. So we have used both the mean and the median levels of that activity per microphone hour per annum, and that is what you're seeing there. We've looked both at ground level data as well as rotor swept data. So whilst this slide is not really relevant in terms of the thresholds. What it does show you is that going forward, one can start to look at what sort of differences between activity level and the actual fatalities on the ground. And there definitely seems to be a pattern in terms of this sort of late summer, early autumn peak and this spring peak, both in activity and fatality data. So this is more research that can be done going forward. When you consider the threshold document, it's important to look, if you're looking at site level, look at your complete area of influence of your wind turbines. So draw a fairly tight polygon around your full rotor swept area. One could also apply the concept to larger areas, as I've said, and basically it's ecoregion specific and size specific. Jonathan asked me to touch on specific, so if you do exceed the threshold, what do you do? And in South Africa, two types of mitigation have been implemented at just a handful of sites, and one being the most commonly known curtailment, where you increase the operational cut-in speed of the blades. In other words, the blades only start spinning when wind speeds reach a certain speed, and that is because bats fly in lower wind speeds generally. We also have paired this information with temperature data because generally bats do not fly in cold conditions. So using a combination of wind and temperature parameters at 3 sites that I've worked on, curtailment has been implemented. And where we've had reliable data at one of the sites, we have seen approximately a 60 to 62% reduction in bat fatalities due to curtailment. So there's definitely merit in that. Acoustic deterrence is a newer form of mitigation. Whilst it has been tested quite widely in the US, in South Africa, I only know of 2 turbines where we've tested it at one of our sites. And whilst this did show very positive results, we have to acknowledge the limitations, and that is that it was only 2 turbines, so the sample size is very small. And as Christian spoke about in his talk 2 weeks ago, turbines are getting larger and larger, and these deterrents as well, only have a certain distance that they can be effective at. So if you're putting a deterrent on a nacelle, it certainly will not reach the full length of the blade, and therefore not protect bats at the latter end or latter tips of the blade. So this needs to be considered for future recommendations. Yeah, so Rachel asked me to touch on sorry, let me just go back, on Africa. And I think this is very important, and I hope we have some people from the rest of Africa on this talk. We have worked at a couple of study areas in other parts of Africa, the DRC, Zambia, and Namibia, as well as in the past with our previous company in other countries like Mozambique and Libya. But there obviously are some unique challenges to Africa, to working in Africa, and some unique circumstances that must be taken into consideration. I also hope that there are some developers listening on this call, and some environmental assessment practitioners, because it's very important that we understand the uniqueness of Africa when it comes to certain challenges. And South Africa's got some of these similar challenges, but let's go through them. So in many African countries, there aren't existing guidelines. So as you see on the screen there, I'm looking at what potential challenges are, and this list is not inclusive, and certainly the solutions are not inclusive, and we can have more discussion around this. But just to get us thinking and maybe looking at the way forward with Africa is that where they cannot develop in-country guidelines, obviously this would be best. They should adapt international guidelines. And in particular, if you're working in Africa, it probably would be advisable to look at the South African guidelines, as well as some of the European guidelines, just because of vicinity and similarity in species. There's often a lack of trained or skilled specialists on the ground in the countries, not by any fault of their own, just because that hasn't been available to them. So it would be important for any specialists coming in to train local people, also look at larger international companies putting out sponsorships or something similar, just to increase the skill level in Africa. We've seen a lot of studies being done at desktop level by international specialists, and they're not really understanding the unique African context or species in Africa. You know, as a result, I would say that only specialists with African experience should work in Africa, because of the importance of understanding the uniqueness of the country. Inadequate pre-screening is done, which is very connected to the point above. So therefore, studies that should be stopped in their tracks before any money is spent on them are not, because not everything of importance has been considered. And yeah, so I urge that shortcuts are not taken, and that only qualified and experienced specialists work in these regions. So you'll see on the right there is obviously that's a picture of Eidolon halvum, the African straw-colored fruit bat. And there are sadly a lot of proposed wind energy facilities within the foraging range or migration sort of pathway of this species. This is the largest migration of mammals globally, and any development within sort of any impact zone of these bats should not be allowed. However, several are being considered anyway. So this is just an example of inadequate pre-screening or unskilled people doing the initial studies. There possibly, like in South Africa, there's challenges around monitoring and compliance. Yeah, we need to put pressure on international bodies and local governments to enforce such monitoring and auditing in terms of compliance. Working out, when I talk about safety of people and equipment, often these areas are very remote and in obviously very poor or underdeveloped areas, and one needs to consider the safety of people and equipment. It's a tough one. I'm not sure how we get over that challenge, but let's keep that in mind. There's obviously malaria and dangerous animals in certain areas where this might not be a challenge in the Northern Hemisphere, for instance. So I urge you to be vigilant, use PPE where required, take malaria prophylaxis, never work alone, have a satellite phone, and always be prepared for an emergency evacuation situation. Yeah, so I've very briefly gone over everything happening in South Africa and some of the challenges faced in Africa. I want to thank the panel that have served with me for the last 7 years. Some have been there that whole time, others are voted on and off, and also my loyal IWS team for a lot of the hard work that's gone into the data collection. And yeah, so I think I'm going to hand over to Jonathan. I understand from Rachel that we will leave questions till the end. Thanks very much.
Excellent. Thank you very, very much, Kate. Yes, so please feel free to either put your questions in the chat box, and we have one of the SABAR panel, Kate Richardson, is kindly going to do the questions at the end. And also a big thank you to Kate and Jonathan for, it was their idea to have these webinars on bats and wind energy. So over to you. Thank you, John.
Okay. Hi, everybody. My name is Jonathan. I've been working on bats and wind energy for about 10 years, most of the time through Arcus Consulting. And my background briefly is I did my master's at the University of Cape Town. I studied the biogeography of horseshoe bats. And almost immediately after that, I started working on bats and wind energy issues. So I'm going to share what I've learned over the last 10 years, focusing mainly on the operational side of things and what we've learned there. So just to give you a bit of, to set the scene, these are the operational wind farms in South Africa. There's 25 of them. There's 961 turbines that are operating. The smallest wind farm has 1 turbine, the largest has 96 turbines. And in total, there's about just over 2,000 megawatts of installed capacity. A typical medium-sized wind farm in South Africa has about 92 megawatts and 42 turbines. South Africa has a renewable energy program, and wind contributes about 52% of it to that. But overall, South Africa's renewable energy contribution is rather low. We still get most of our power from coal. That is changing. This is the predicted, or not predicted, this is the expected cumulative megawatts of installed capacity over the next 20 or 30 years. And as you can see, there's a sharp rise in installed capacity from about next year, or from about this year actually, all the way for the next 10 years. So this is a good time to be reflecting on what we've learned in the past 10 years, looking forward to the next 10 years. So let's get into that. So most of the lessons we've learned have been enabled by South Africa's pretty good environmental management standards, which are arguably really, really good. So specifically for this sector, we have an intense period of data collection before a wind farm is built, followed by another period of intense data collection after the wind farm is operational, or while the wind farm is operational. So most wind farms have environmental condition that they have to search for carcasses. And this document on the right is our attempt to present best practice standards for that work. And we've recently updated it this year. The basic premise of this document is to provide methods that we can use to collect fatality data, and that we can use those data to estimate fatality. And the reason fatality needs to be estimated is because not all carcasses that collide with turbines will be found. And this is because bats can be injured when they collide with blades and crawl outside of the search area. They can also be removed by carcasses before they are found. And bats are very cryptic, and they're small, and they can easily be overlooked in the search areas amongst vegetation. So we typically do this work for 2 years, and the searching is usually performed by local community members who live adjacent or nearby the wind farm, and the work is overseen by a consultant or a principal investigator. So let's get into those lessons. There's 3 main lessons that I'm going to be talking about today. The first is about search efforts. The second is talking about which species are impacted. And the third is talking about not all wind farms are impacting bats or appear to impact bats. So let's talk about search effort first. Let's start with the good. So compared to other regions, I think the search effort in South Africa is relatively high and extremely high. We heard about 2 weeks ago that in a lot of countries in Europe, searching isn't mandatory. Whereas for us, we have mandatory searching for 2 years. Not all wind farms in South Africa have done 2 years, but it is part of our best practice. And searching is undertaken Monday through Friday by dedicated teams of 2, 4, 6 people sometimes, and sometimes even larger than that. So we've completed about over 50,000 searches since 2011. So really a lot of effort has been spent on the ground trying to find carcasses. At some wind farms I've worked at personally, we've done near daily searching for carcasses to try and find out what's happening, and we found very low numbers. That's the good. The bad and the ugly is that we have quite differential search efforts across wind farms in South Africa, and that makes it difficult to compare impacts across different wind farms. Our best practice search interval, which is the number of days between searches of a particular turbine, was 7 days. We've recently changed that to twice a week. So we intended to search each turbine once a week, essentially. However, the realized search interval, or what the search interval actually is on average about 13 days. But you can see there's a huge range in that. So that ranges from 0.6 to almost 60 days between searches of particular turbines. And if you're searching a turbine once every 60 days, you're really not going to be able to tell or learn much about what's happening at that turbine, what those groups of turbines. And the reason we have a difference in what we intend to have as a search interval and what actually happens is because of a number of reasons. We don't have searching on weekends and public holidays and during the Christmas break, which is totally acceptable. We have to have time off from work. But there are other reasons like turbine maintenance, vehicle issues, transport issues, snakes, and human resource challenges that prevent us from searching turbines quite often. And sometimes that results in really big breaks. There's a really big break from about early December to early January in South Africa, where the whole country seems to stop working, and that applies to this work too. So really in December and early January, I think of the picture that we have is skewed because we have such little search effort in those periods. Searching is very difficult. It's labor intensive and boring. I've done it myself personally at a very short study, and it takes a lot of effort and it's hard work. The other issues we have are we have insufficient bias trial data. So part of our guidelines is we prescribe a minimum number of bias trials that we need to do in order to try and correct for searcher efficiency and carcasses being removed by scavengers. If you don't do enough of those trials, that influences your overall estimate. And a lot of sites have insufficient trials, so we're not getting a true picture of searcher efficiency and carcass persistence at some sites, which influences our overall fatality estimates. Generally, I think the idea to employ local communities was a good one, but I don't think we're getting the best out of them at the moment. And I think of those 50,000 searches, a lot of that has been wasted effort, unfortunately. And here's some evidence to back that up. So here are some data that I've been working on. Let's start in the top left. We have the distance that carcasses were found from turbines. You can see that most carcasses are found within 10, 20, 30 meters from the turbine base. But you can also see at the end of the scale, we've been searching out to 200 meters. Most projects search out to that distance as a standard. And part of the reason for that is because we combine this work with bird searching, and they have a larger area required to search because bird carcasses are larger, and therefore the ballistics of those large carcasses means they land further away from the turbines. So by combining our search effort with birds, it's kind of jeopardized the quality of the bat studies themselves. So I think we should be moving towards separating those two studies. And I think we should be putting a lot of effort into the first 30 or 40 meters from turbines and not searching beyond that. And that'll enable us to search more frequently and to search more turbines, because less time will be needed to search out to these far distances where we really are finding very, very little carcasses. The second aspect is the visibility. So there is a big difference in the searcher efficiency. If you look in the top right, the probability of finding a carcass in different visibility classes. So you can see clearly that it's a lot easier to find a carcass in easy visibility classes compared to difficult. So most of the time, the proportion of carcasses that are found in the easy visibility classes is about 60 or 70%, but there's quite a big range in that, as you can see. Whereas in the difficult visibility class, only about 20%, sometimes less than 20% of carcasses are being found through search efficiency trials. So I think we really need to, this data is suggesting that we really need to focus our effort closer to the turbine in areas that are easy to search. And finally, if you look at the bottom graph here, we have carcass persistence in days across 5 different regions in the country. And you can see there's vast differences in the length of time carcasses persist across different regions. So in region number 1, carcasses are typically persisting for 6 or 7 days, which means it's appropriate to search turbines with that sort of interval. If you look at region number 2, if you're only searching turbines every 6 or 7 days, but the carcass is only persisting for 2 days, sometimes less than that, you're really not going to get a complete picture of what's happening with carcass persistence. And a number of trials we've done, we've set out carcasses and we've seen them being removed almost immediately from bird scavengers. So carcass persistence at some carcass scavenging at some farms is really a problem. And it does have a regional effect. Finally, Kate showed something similar to this earlier. You can see clearly that in winter, the number of carcasses that are found is much lower than other times of the year. So perhaps we don't need to be searching as much in winter, and we can focus more of our energy and effort searching in February, March, and April, where most carcasses are being found. And recently, similar findings have been presented for in Australia, where they found that carcass searching has not been fit for purpose and not providing the results that are needed for really understanding what's happening on the ground at these wind farms. In addition, on the right, you can see a piece of work from Manuela Huso from the United States Geological Survey. She's proposing to simplify the monitoring process by focusing, searching in areas where there's a high probability of finding a carcass. So this is the easy search areas that I showed earlier. And these are typically the roads and the pads. So I think we need to be searching turbines more regularly on the roads and the pads and during key parts of the year, like autumn and spring and parts of summer. And I think that'll give us a much better idea of what's happening at our wind farms in South Africa. In addition, if we want to start thinking about other options for searching, Emma Bennett in Australia has done a great job of using dogs for carcass searching. And I think, stand corrected, but I think dogs are or have become part of the best practice standards in Australia. Don't quote me on that, but I think there's a lot of effort in using dogs in Australia. And at least Emma's work has shown that it is quite successful. The issue with using dogs in South Africa is that there's an argument that using dogs means less people will be employed. However, if we look across our 10 years and across all our wind farms, at best, we've maybe employed 200 to 300 people to do carcass searching work, which obviously makes a key difference to their individual lives and the lives of their family because they can earn an income. But it does very little to reduce the ultimate unemployment rate, which is almost 30% in South Africa. So perhaps dogs can complement human searching in some way, perhaps at wind farms that are more risky or where impacts have been shown to be high, dogs can be used to complement human searches in those situations. And there's a long history of using dogs for conservation projects in South Africa. So I think there's a community of practice that we can learn from, that we can apply in wind farms in South Africa. And then if you want to think completely out the box, there is some technology out there that's quite new that is proposing an alternative to human searching and dog searching. It's called Beefinder. I don't know much about it, but I think the premise basically is that they have various sensors on the turbine tower, and a collision is detected if an object crosses all three sensors within a particular time frame. You can research it more at this URL. I don't know much about it, but it's good to see that people are trying to come up with different ways to really understand this issue of carcass searching. And with that, let's start talking about the species that have been impacted in South Africa. We have a small body of evidence of published research that talks about this. The first was in 2011. Anna Doty and Paul Martin searched the single Kucha turbine near Port Elizabeth for 1 year, and they found 10 Neramisia capensis carcasses and 8 Tadiri egyptiaca carcasses, the Egyptian fetal bat. One of these carcasses was injured, and that is something that we need to consider. Not all carcasses do get killed. The second piece of work was done by myself and some colleagues at that wind farm in Darling. We searched for 2 months, once a week, and we found 1 Neramisia capensis, the Cape Serotine. And then the latest published research we have is from Kate. Kate did carcass searching, and across a year and a half, she found 68 bat carcasses across 44 wind turbines. Most of these were insectivorous bat species, but 6 of them were fruit bats. 4 of them were the Egyptian rosette, and 2 were Epimorphus warburgi. And then moving to some unpublished data, these are the families of bats that are being killed at wind farms in South Africa. And you can see there's at least six of the 8, I think, families of bats in South Africa. And there's a couple of things I want to highlight here. The first is the unknown families. So 10% of carcasses can't be identified to the family level by consultants. And of that 10%, almost 30% can't be identified to species or genus. So there is an effort for us to, and it's in our guidelines, to encourage people to send carcasses to museums to be identified correctly so we can have a better sense of which species are being impacted. So Kate's work with Lee Richards at the Durban Natural Science Museum is part of that effort to try and understand which species are being impacted and the demographics of those species in terms of age, male, females, etc. The second thing I want to highlight on this slide is in North America, migratory bats tend to make up a large portion of carcasses. In Europe, it's quite similar, but to a lesser degree, and more resident bat species are impacted. In South Africa, the Natal long-fingered bat is our main migratory bat species that makes up a small percentage of overall fatality. Most of these carcasses for that species come from a particular region in South Africa. And that's in contrast to the Egyptian free-tailed bat, which is one of the most widespread species of bat in South Africa. And this species makes up the largest proportion of carcasses found at South African wind farms. And you can see it's pictured over here, like one of our carcasses. So this particular species of bat or family of bats is adapted in their echolocation and wing morphology to fly in open areas high in the air. And this often overlaps with the same airspace that wind turbine blades are spinning. South Africa has a relatively low free-tailed bat diversity compared to other parts of Africa. On the left, you can see the distribution from the African Corruption Report of free-tailed bat species in South Africa. Each dot represents a different species. So you can see 5 species listed there. The purple dots are the Egyptian free-tailed bats. On the left, we've zoomed into East Africa and Northern Mozambique. You can see there's a lot more different species of free-tailed bats. And this region, Northern Mozambique and East Africa, wind energy is growing. So I think impacts to free-tailed bats is going to be an issue in these regions. Similarly, fruit bat diversity is also higher in these regions. And from South Africa, we know that fruit bats are impacted. So having said that, my third lesson is that not all wind farms appear to have an impact on bats. So we know that fatalities have occurred at all wind farms in South Africa, including from single turbine projects to 96 turbine projects. We know that there are some regional differences in observed and estimated fatality, but it's difficult to understand the exact reasons for this. They're unclear. We don't know if these are sampling artifacts. So that's linking back to my first lesson about the search effort. We don't know if it's related to landscape or topography or to ecological reasons at these wind farms. We don't know if they're related to wind farm characteristics. Now, the reason I say not all wind packs appear to have an impact on bats is because there's a very common saying in statistical modeling. It goes garbage in, garbage out. Now, I'm not saying that we as a community of practice having putting poor data into our estimating models. I think the data we have collected so far has been very valuable and it's enabled us to learn a lot. But I think we can aim to be putting better information into these models, these estimated models, so that we can get more reliable outputs that can help us understand impact better. I think we do understand that zero fatality is not a reality for us, especially since we need alternative energy sources. So one of the questions that I'm grappling with is, are the impacts on bats at low impact wind farms acceptable? And this is where the thresholds come in. I think in South Africa, the industry as a whole understands that we need to consider impact to bats. And as a community, we do have a good working relationship with developers And we have an open and constructive discussions with them through SubApp, for which I'm very grateful. And I think it's very challenging to give them all the answers that they need, especially at the rate that they need them. Hopefully, if we can tighten up our operational monitoring, we can begin to close some of those gaps. So just to conclude, my main lessons are related to the search effort. It's important to understand search effort. And I think I've given some potential solutions to try and improve search effort by focusing on areas that are easy to search, such as the rodent pads, closer to the wind turbine. Secondly, we know fetal bats are the most impacted species. And this is a concern because turbines are getting larger and taking up large airspaces, which could further contribute to more impact for this particular family of bats. And this is also going to be challenging in other parts of Africa where bat diversity is much higher, especially for fetal bats and fruit bats. And finally, not all wind farms appear to have large impact on bats, but as I've tried to show, it's difficult to know why or if this is true in reality. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Jonathan. That was really great. So I just we're conscious of time, so I know some of you have to shoot off. So thank you very much for joining. And if you need to shoot off, then please do so. If anybody wants to leave any comments or thanks for the speakers, I'll make sure that they get those. But for those of you who have time, it'd be really great if you could stick around because there's going to be lots of questions after these fantastic talks. So please do. And I'm just going to hand over to Kate Richardson. Thank you very much, Kate. Over to you.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for having us here. Okay, question one, and I think I'm going to aim this one at Kate. It's from Ross. Most of your monitoring appeared to be acoustic. What methodologies do you use for fruit bats?
Hi, Ross. Thanks for your question. And I'm actually glad you raised it because my presentation didn't show that in our guidelines, we do have a section for fruit bats. So there is visual monitoring methods that are mandatory for areas where you do suspect there will be fruit bats. So we do visual assessments, both in terms of presence or evidence of presence of fruit bats through spit outs, etc. Listening for certain vocal calls of male bats. Where they're cave-dwelling fruit bats like Rosetta aegyptiacus, we want to do cave surveys if that's possible. And whilst it's not a minimum requirement, you know, if one does have access to thermal imagery cameras or something similar to that, you can employ those tactics. But fruit bats are dealt with in the guidelines. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Okay, this is from an iPhone to Alvaro. There were 3 wind farms, Kate again. There were 3 wind farms where curtailment has been applied, but you only spoke about the outcomes at 1. Have you any idea what the results were for the other 2?
So whilst we do feel that they were successful, as Jonathan alluded to in his talks, operational monitoring often comes with certain challenges, and the data that was not very comparable, the pre and post curtailment data. So I cannot be certain on those statistics. However, it does appear anecdotally that those results were successful, but due to either at the one wind farm, for instance, they didn't carry on with the monitoring. So therefore that one, we don't know what's happening there. And at the other one, there were large gaps in the operational monitoring due to various reasons. So that information is also really not usable. But anecdotally, it appears that there was success. But the one I reported on is the only one where we can feel confident. We had good data the year before we applied curtailment, good data in the year we applied curtailment, and good data in the year after.
Great, thanks. Oh, okay. I'm going to aim this next one at John, and I think you've actually probably already answered it. Are dogs trained and used in searches in South Africa? As far as I know, we've done 1 study with dogs. Do you know if there's any others?
There has been 1 study that's done at Eskom's wind farm. I don't know if anyone from Eskom is on this call. If they are, you can unmute and actually let us know how it went. As far as I know, it was challenging. And I think part of the challenge was heat. But having said that, Australia is as hot, maybe even hotter than South Africa. So if it works in Australia, I think it can work here. But as far as I know, it hasn't been commercially used to any large degree. There was one study that, one consultancy report that mentioned the use of dogs, but I don't know, it's not clear in that report the degree to which they used them. While I'm here, there's another question that I see about Nycteris. Can I answer that one while I'm here?
Please do, yes.
Yes, that's Nycteris thebaca carcass. I am confident of the ID. I know the group of people that ID'd that bat. I know they're skilled. I've studied with them, so I do trust the ID itself. Whether or not that that carcass was killed by a wind turbine is a different question. It was found near a turbine. I don't have the exact distance. We don't have the coordinates of that carcass, but according to that report that was issued, it was attributed to a turbine. And it is surprising, I agree, because that species does not fly high as you alluded to. I'm not sure who that was.
Yeah, that was Paul Wabala. Yeah.
Yeah, but I wouldn't. Yeah, I mean, it's unsure if it died of natural causes. We don't know. So we can't discount it.
Okay, super. Thanks, John. If I can just jump in with the trained dogs as well, I do know that one of the problems was the dogs were incredibly expensive to train, and then they sat around and did nothing when they didn't have any searching to do. And so it was a lot of money to keep them going. So, yeah. Okay, from Nolo Magnano, Jonathan, please can you elaborate on not getting the best outcomes when local communities were doing carcass searches? I think you mentioned it was kind of boredom and it's not the easiest job.
That kind of plays into it. I mean, it's hot, it's windy, it's cold. And I mean, put yourself in that situation. You're there outside the whole day. Your performance as an individual would decline over time. And that's completely understandable. So that's what I mean by not getting the best out of it. What I also mean is that the people who do this work are ecological consultants. So myself, Kate, a range of other people, we're ecologists. We're not trained in how to deal with human resource challenges, how to deal with social issues. And I think that's what I mean by not getting the best out. If we had better understanding of social issues, the reasons people, the motivations for people for taking this work, we could empathize more with them, and then through that empathy, try and get the best out of them. So we're coming from the same place.
Yeah, super. Thanks, John.
Can I add a little bit to that?
Please do.
Okay, so I think John's answered a lot of what I would have said too, and the key thing is there's keeping them motivated, and that means regular encouragement and training, but also there's practical issues, and often that is the car breaks down or someone's sick, and financial reasons. Sometimes it's contractual issues between whoever's employing them, and that affects the work. So there's various issues. There's also weather plays a role in terms of attendance. So there's various issues. It's motivation, and various practical issues that can affect the work quality.
Thanks, Kate. Yep. This one's directed at John, but I'm pretty sure Lee is also on this call. So Lee, if you'd like to unmute yourself and jump in as well. Jonathan, how many consultants are willing or able to send carcasses to the museums? And then are these data made publicly available?
I think they're all willing. Being able is another question. It is difficult. There's a strict protocol for sending carcasses across the country that you need to adhere to. So that in itself is something that will tend to not encourage people, to dissuade people, because of the effort that you need to go to send those carcasses to museums in the correct way, that they can be used in the correct way. That's unfortunate. I don't think there's any way around it. I think the process is as simple as it needs to be, but even that simplicity is difficult to adhere to.
Yeah, I would agree. We need to get permits for sending them, etc., which is always an issue. And I do think, again, if we've got wind energy people on the call here, a request that actually we do need those carcasses. I know there was one particular wind farm where the carcasses were stored in a deep freeze and the electricity went off, so they threw them all out. Now, if only they'd contacted the museum and said the electricity's gone off, the museum might have been able to do something.
Can I just add in another comment here? At our AGM last year, I think David Jacobs spoke about some of the work that Lee's done and about about the Egyptian fetal bat. And there's some thought that the first talk in this series was by Ara, and Ara spoke a lot about bat taxonomy, and there's a lot we still don't know about bat taxonomy. And some people think that, have good reason to believe that that species, the Egyptian fetal bat, is probably more than one species. So by not knowing, having an unknown carcass, we really have no idea what we're impacting. And we could be impacting cryptic species, very rare species. So it's very, very important that we try and get a good handle of what species are being killed and sending them to museums for professional identification.
Yeah, thanks, John. I totally agree. Yeah. Next question then is directed at Kate. What advice would you have for government officials assessing assessments, particularly given it's a new industry in many African countries? Kind of how do you start?
Thanks, good question. So I think the important thing is that to stay informed. I would encourage all government authorities to be on top of the guidelines. If they don't have their own in-country guidelines, to be on top of international guidelines that would be relevant to them. In terms of also, I'm also addressing this to South African authorities, is to stay involved. If there are workshops that are made available to you, I encourage attendance. My experience is that at some of them where we have invited various people, there's a very low attendance at these meetings, and it's always the same faces. I would encourage many more to attend and to make themselves aware of what is going on. I would also encourage cooperative governance. I know it's often a word that's used at sort of national and local levels of government, but I don't see it happening in practice. So it seems that a lot of different departments within government don't talk to each other, and where there should be a flow of information and a flow of decision making, I don't see that happening. So I would encourage cooperative governance, staying informed, and asking questions. There are these bodies available like SABAR, etc., BirdLife. If you're unsure of something, ask. That's what we're here for. And not many questions come in from government, or actually none. So most of the questions come in from consultants or developers. But if you need assistance or need advice, please ask.
Thanks, Kate. That's super. Yeah. Jonathan, we're going to have to go back to your presentation because the question is 2 slides before the conclusion slide. Are the mortalities due to wind farms? I'm not entirely sure.
I think this is in reference to the Nycteris. So just to repeat, we think it's related to the wind farm, just based on the circumstances, but it's difficult to know because it's just one individual of that species. So it could have been any other cause, but I mean, it could be old age, but generally, yeah, I mean, what are the other natural causes besides for a low number of predators and illness, it would cause that bat to land pretty near a wind turbine. So it's you need to think about the probability. Did it randomly decide to die of natural causes near a turbine, or is it more likely that it was impacted by a turbine? I can tell you now that those blades at that particular farm, I can tell you how close they come down to the ground if you give me 1 minute.
Yeah, so while John's looking for that information, if I can just say that's exactly what I was going to say, is that some of the older turbines do sweep lower, so he's going to find that information out for us. But it's not just blunt force trauma that can kill animals, and there can be some pressure differential at the tip of the blade that could have also had an impact. So if this blade was sweeping lower to the ground, than some of the more modern, larger turbines. And there was a sort of extreme pressure differential. It is possible that sort of a Nycteris flying higher than usual did come into some sort of impact zone.
Those blades are 35 meters above the ground.
Yeah, Nycteris could do that. Yeah. Okay, from Ross again, could we have a link to the work on the acoustic deterrent? Kate, that's you. I don't know that it's been published, has it?
No, it hasn't been published. It's in a sort of site-specific monitoring report. That's, yeah, we'd have to discuss it with the client, but they normally are quite open to sharing that particular client. So we could ask. Yeah,
super, thanks. Okay, just a comment from Rachel. A study in the UK showed that dogs were better at searching than humans. Yep, there are just other considerations to be taken into account. Here's a really interesting one from Paul because, yeah, it's a really good question. Why don't we get more emballonurids flying high or being hit by wind turbines? Because we're not getting very many, and yet they are high flying. Either of you?
It might be the distribution overlap between where wind farms are and where the species is found.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's to do with distribution.
Okay, great. Okay, thank you very much, both of you. There's a lot of very nice. Thank you very much for these talks. They were really super, and it's interesting to hear it all. I think. Oh, just one more question from me, and it's just putting it out there. We know with particular species in particular parts of the country, the numbers fluctuate drastically year on year. How do we take that into account if we're only monitoring for 1 year pre-construction?
Yeah, it's a consideration, as you know, that we've dappled with in several of our meetings. You know, the only grace that I think we have is that there is the operational monitoring that happens afterwards, where we are, you know, ground truthing some of those sort of predictions.
Super. Thanks so much. Yeah. Thank you then. I think that's us run out of questions. I'm going to pass back to Rachel.
Thank you very much, Kate, for doing the questions, and a huge thank you to Jonathan and Kate MacEwan for our great session today. Please do feel free to send us any suggestions, as Kate and the SABAR team had suggested our last speakers as well. We're very open to that. We're going to be running these webinars again next year, so if people have ideas and suggestions. Also, we'll be putting this on YouTube, and we'll be sending you some links to the papers that Kate and John were talking about. So thank you very much, everybody, and take care. Bye.
Thanks, Rachel. Okay, thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thanks. Thank you.
Thanks.